You're here because you're asking, are NFTs really art? And how on earth does it make sense that people are paying tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars for these things? Can somebody please explain this to me? I got you. I'm Mitchell F. Chan, and this is the first in a series of 5 video essays about the ways that art based on non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, are connected to ideas in contemporary art that have been around for decades. These videos are intended for artists and collectors in the NFT space who are interested in knowing more about how this technology connects to art history, or for people in the traditional contemporary art world who are wondering, what is this NFT stuff all about? In every episode, we'll talk about a theme in contemporary art. We'll look at some historical works that I think help us find meaning in the emerging body of NFT-based artworks, and we'll start a conversation about how those ideas can be explored further. Finally, I'll show you some works that I think start that exploration. Okay, so I think that there are 2 ways to look at the core concept of NFTs as a whole. The first way, which is to just look at these as collectible tokens, is easy. And this is going to be probably the first ever art history lecture that opens with a tweet from Mark Cuban, because he explained it pretty darn well in under 256 characters. He said, once you realize that the sense of ownership is the same for a digital collectible as it is for a physical one, you come to the realization that holding, maintaining, grading, shipping, buying, selling a physical good is a hassle. Okay, now I think that's a pretty darn concise explanation of the value proposition of NFTs as collectibles, like with Top Shots or trading cards. And if that's enough for you, great, we're done. You can skip the rest of the video. But if you're still here asking, is it art?
Yes, but is it art?
Yes, but is it art?
We're going to need a little bit more time. When we think about NFTs as art, it's probably fair to say that most of us are gawking not just at the artworks themselves, but also at this super hot marketplace for them that we're seeing. So there are 2 ideas in play here. 1, the idea that the experience of an artwork is not necessarily linked to a physical object. And number 2, the idea that the experience of an artwork is necessarily linked to the concept of ownership. So thinking about NFTs in this context is always going to take a little bit more time, partially because is it art conversations always seem to go on for a while. But we're going to try to crank this out in about 20 minutes using what I think is the exemplary art history case study for tokens as artworks. So after the break, I'm going to talk about Yves Klein, the artist who I think predicted all of this NFT stuff over 50 years ago. So let me paint a picture for you. The year is 1958, and you're in Paris, outside 3 Rue des Beaux-Arts, the site of Galerie Iris Claire. Actually, you're a ways down the block from there because you are in a long lineup to get into the gallery to see the newest exhibition by art world sensation Yves Klein. As you finally get to the gallery, you see that the windows have been blocked out with panels painted in an incredible deep shade of blue. This is Klein's trademark color. The entrance to the gallery is shrouded with a luxurious curtain of the same color. Finally, you've made it to the entrance of the gallery. Congratulations! Before you enter, the artist himself hands you a cocktail to celebrate: gin, Cointreau, and methylene blue. And you can sip on it while you enjoy the exhibition. You enter the gallery teeming with anticipation, ready to see this newest masterpiece by one of the art world's most celebrated sensations, and there's nothing there. Not even the color blue. In fact, prior to the exhibition, Klein meticulously repainted the whole gallery white, just to make sure the space would look as empty as possible. You stand in the empty space for a while, and a while longer. You leave, making room for the next visitor. Outside, some people who have been through the gallery are confused or even angry, but a lot of them are moved nearly to tears. Albert Camus is here. He's in awe. He's written a brief note for Klein: with the void, full powers. Whew. at least with an NFT, you have something to look at. So what's happened here? Has Yves Klein just perpetrated the greatest scam in art history? Is this the art world version of the Emperor's New Clothes? The answer, and I'm comfortable saying this definitively because I think that most people who have studied art history and who are a lot smarter than me would agree, the answer is definitely no. These invisible artworks, which would come to be known as the zone de sensibilité picturale immatérielle, or the apotheosis, the very purest manifestation of an idea that had been developing in art for decades. The idea that an artwork was an idea or experience that is completely independent of its physical container. It's an understanding of art that is probably worth coming back to in this moment. And these ideas might help us to think intelligently and critically about the emerging NFT space. And just maybe, some art made on blockchain and tokens can bring a new set of tools and a big group of artists into this conversation. We'll take a short break, and in the next part, we'll explain how that conversation about separating artwork from a physical token developed over the course of half a century. So to really understand the meaning of Klein's zones, and to understand the meaning of any artwork really, we need to take a closer look at the history of Klein's career up to that point, and the history of the art ideas that he was building on. There are many different intertwining threads of ideas that played out over the first half of the 20th century. Here's a 10-second history of one of those threads. It goes like this. Art used to start with a real thing, and then art would try to copy it. The more the art resembles the real thing, the better it was. Then, art could start with a real thing, but make it look different. The more ingenious your way of making it look different, the better. Finally, final step. Art doesn't have to start with a real thing at all. Art is its own thing. It can be a completely original phenomenon in itself. Boom. Just wrote your first modern art history term paper for you. You're welcome. Now, how does this relate to Klein? Yves Klein is probably still best known for his blue monochromes. These paintings are about that last step in the 10-second history that I just gave you. The idea that art could stop representing things and be its own thing unto itself. His monochromes look kind of like some other paintings that were trying to embody the same ideas, like this one. When the Russian suprematist painter Kazimir Malevich painted this in 1915, he's trying to really throw down the gauntlet and say, no, my painting is not an abstraction of a real thing. It does not represent a real thing. It is not an imitation of a real thing. It is simply a black square to be taken on its own terms. And that's probably why he titled the piece Black Square and not Black Bear at Midnight. Klein's monochromes are definitely inspired by this work, but they push this idea forward a bit in both their concept and their technical execution. Conceptually, Klein isn't satisfied with leaving the conversation where Malevich left it by saying, this painting is just a painting. He truly believes that his art is a sensation, a feeling, something that we might call today a state of mindfulness. In other words, his painting is more than a painting. He doesn't even want it to be a painting. So he actually does a couple of very smart things with his craft and his use of painting technology. First of all, he uses his patented blue. And when I say patented, I mean he literally patented this color of blue. So this incredibly deep but flat blue, it obliterates the picture plane. What do I mean by that? I mean, it's so flat and so hypnotic that if you stare at it, it seems to have infinite depth, and you can no longer tell really where the canvas is in front of you. It becomes space. And you think about it, if you've used a glossy paint, you'd see specular highlights, reflections. You're aware of where that reflective surface is. But when the paint is purely matte, it's a huge question. That's what we call obliterating the picture plane in this case. The other sort of technology thing he'd do is he'd mount the monochromes on pegs that pushed it off the wall a few inches. And so that would further mess with your ability to perceive it as a flat painting on the wall. So Klein is desperately trying to get to the point where his art can be just pure sensation. But he has this problem where no matter what he does, it's still a more or less rectangular thing on the wall. It's still an object. And for him, the physical aspect of his artwork is holding him back. And so Klein is way ahead of where some people are in the NFT debate. He's not asking if something without a physical aspect can be art. He's going further, saying that to be art, something needs to have no physical aspect. This idea of an artwork that is more pure idea and less physical material, well, that idea is sometimes called dematerialization. And it's absolutely crucial to point out here that Klein is a true believer in this idea. And none of this works if he doesn't have a long history of exploring these ideas across multiple artworks and exhibitions that he's invested his whole career into. Around the same time that he was preparing for the zones, he was drawing up plans for buildings that would use only pillars of fire and columns of blown air. It's crazy stuff, sure, but there's a tidy story connecting the monochromes to this architecture of air and finally to the zones. So the zones were absolutely the apotheosis of Klein's quest to present an artwork that was pure idea. Because according to Klein, these zones weren't empty. He claimed that they were imbued with the sensibility of the color blue. And so when he presented the zones at a later exhibition, he stood in the gallery and he loudly declared, "First there is nothing, then there is a deep nothing, then a blue depth." In Klein's own words, what he wanted to achieve with these works was, quote, "the creation of an ambience, of a real pictorial climate, one that is therefore invisible." He claimed that the sensation of the color blue was there in the room with you, even if you couldn't see it. He claimed that this exhibition would literally impregnate viewers with the color blue. When the visitors to that exhibition came home, they would find that that was true in at least one sense. That cocktail you drank with the cointreau and the methylene blue, it dyed your pee blue. And because I know that Klein had devoted his life to these ideas of immateriality, I believe him. Klein had created an artwork that contained the sensibility or the idea or produced the sensation of a visual experience without relying on paint, canvas, or any material at all. And of course, he had to bring the entire history of his career to bear to give that idea credibility. But yeah, I believe in it. And a lot of other people did too. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about Yves Klein and his mystical, invisible artworks. But what does this mean for NFTs? Cry the NFT enthusiasts and skeptics alike. Well, first of all, recognizing half-century-old art ideas like this, it goes a long way to legitimizing the claim that, no, an artwork does not need to have a physical aspect. And that's important, because that's the first part of the debate that we talked about in the opening after looking at that Mark Cuban tweet. But I think if you're working in NFT art and you really want to be an artist, it's important to think about artistic value as separate from collectability. And Yves Klein is a really great example of someone who truly believed that an artwork was an idea, that an artwork was an experience, but that an artwork was never a physical thing. Okay, so that's established. But guys, let's talk about the second part of that understanding. Let's talk about the elephant in the room here. Let's talk about the money. Well, you see, this part of the conversation is where Yves Klein goes from run-of-the-mill clever art boy to true genius. If you think these invisible zones of immaterial pictorial sensibility are fascinating, wait till you get to the next part of this video and wait till you hear what these things cost. here's the thesis that we're going to come back to again and again in this video series. Artistic value must be expressed through a system of capital. I didn't make that rule, but I think that centuries of art history show us that it's true. I'm going to take my time unpacking that statement across this whole series, but let's talk about what it means for Yves Klein's zones of immaterial pictorial sensibility. The relationship between art and materiality was just one of the ideas that Klein was exploring. And as I said before, it's an idea that I think he pushed forward incrementally with some of the techniques that he used. But the other thing that he was exploring was the question of, what does it mean to own an idea? You see, the zones of immaterial pictorial sensibility were for sale. And that meant that someone could own that feeling of the color blue. But to own this most immaterial of artworks, you had to pay in the most material of currencies, pure gold. That's right, you could only buy these invisible artworks for gold. And people did. And so when you handed over your 20 grams of gold for this zone, you did get something physical in return. You got this, a receipt, a token. That acknowledges your legal ownership of the zone. That's it. That's the only physical thing you get. But wait, it doesn't stop there. Once again, Klein takes it further. Just like he took this notion of art as idea and took that further by saying that, the object was actually in conflict with art as an idea, Klein did something to say that owning an idea was actually in conflict with experiencing the idea. Because Klein recognizes, like Mark Cuban did in that tweet, that while physicality or materiality is not strongly linked to a sense of connection with the thing, ownership is really strongly linked to a sense of connection with a thing. That's true whether the thing in question is an esoteric art idea, a sensation, or a rookie card. And Klein wants to push past that. So Klein says, if you want a receipt to say that you now own this idea, you have to pay for it in gold. But, he says, you won't really own what he calls the true immaterial value of the artwork. It won't become a part of you the way an artwork that you own is supposed to become a part of you. To have that, you have to participate in this ritual. He says, meet me at the River Seine. Bring the little paper token that I gave you in exchange for that 20 grams of gold. And burn that token. And I'll throw half the gold in the river. And now, and only now, will you truly understand what it means to own that artwork. There are 3 well-documented instances of collectors performing this ritual with Klein. Burning the paper receipt that now would be worth a lot of money if they were to sell it to a museum. Watching Klein throw only half, his gold into the river. And sharing this connection with the artwork, which again is supposed to contain the immaterial essence of the color blue. One collector who actually did this described his experience, writing that he had, quote, no other experience in art equal to the depth of feeling. It evoked in me a shock of self-recognition and an explosion of awareness in time and space. It's interesting to me that burning is one of the functions that is by default included in NFT token contracts. And I know that there are some collectors out there who have made big money purchases and then publicly burned the token. I recognize that doing this is typically what we call a flex, a display of that collector's wealth and the breadth of their collection. But if you are someone who has done this, if you've burned a token connected to an artwork that you've bought, please reach out to me because I need to know. How did it feel? Do you feel like you too now own the artwork absolutely and intrinsically the way Klein thought you would? Please get in touch. Okay, so that's a lot about Yves Klein and the zones. And hopefully you've seen how some of these really esoteric conversations that were happening in art around 1960 are really, really relevant right now. And we've seen how Klein's zones were sort of the original tokenized artwork. But just as Klein would use his new technologies, namely his paint and his mounting techniques, to improve on Malevich's ideas of abstraction, so were there artists who would use the new tools of blockchain to improve on Klein's ideas of immateriality. Even as blockchain and smart contracts were in their infancy, some artists were already thinking about applying these technologies to conceptual art. And I was one of them. After the break, I'll show some early blockchain art from 2017 that I think is worth looking at, as we try to find some interesting signals in the noise of the crowded NFT art scene. So let's bring all this art talk back to the world of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and NFTs. Because for about as long as there's been blockchain, there have been artists who have used contemporary art to explain blockchain, and conversely, used blockchain to explain contemporary art. And some of these early blockchain art projects are really interesting. The first gallery exhibition of blockchain art that I can find was this. The exhibition was titled The Human Face of Crypto Economies, and it was organized by Furtherfield. They followed that up in 2017 with this exhibition, New World Order, which was accompanied by an excellent book titled Artists Rethinking the Blockchain that puts into print a lot of the art ideas that were being explored through blockchain at the time by artists like Rob Myers and others. In later episodes of this series, we'll talk more about some of these early works, but for now, I'll just talk about what I know best. Over the 15 years that I've been an artist, I've done two things. Like Yves Klein, I've also been interested in making art out of extremely minimal physical substance. But unlike Yves Klein, I haven't done it to make an art that's disconnected from our temporal world. I've done it because I'm trying to represent a real world which feels increasingly insubstantial. Like this sculpture depicting a conversation. It's made out of water vapor because it had stopped feeling like conversations were made of anything substantial. Or this sculpture, a volumetric shape that seems like you should be able to touch it, but it's really just a two-dimensional string spinning around very quickly because someone close to me had died, but it felt like they were still there somehow. The other thing I do is I take old art ideas and I remake them using new technology. I do this because I think it helps me understand both the art idea better and the technology better. Like this sculpture from 2014, which takes an artwork by Sol LeWitt and turns it into computer code, because I was interested to know if you could still sell an idea at a time when ideas apparently wanted to be free. And this sculpture, which takes Turner's slave ship and turns it into a little robotic puddle of velvet ropes, because I think an art gallery is a silly place to have a conversation if you're trying to change the whole world. But in 2017, both of these things that I do came together in one piece, a piece I called The Digital Zones of Immaterial Pictorial Sensibility. See, when I saw Bitcoin, I saw the ideas of Yves Klein writ large. A Bitcoin is a sensibility, a feeling, an idea of financial value that has no reference to the material world. And like Yves Klein's artworks, enough people believe in that idea that its value becomes fact. Klein would have loved it. Like in Klein's works, Bitcoin sees the physical as an impediment to true value. Paper money can be counterfeited, reprinted, or quantitatively eased. But a store of value that's nothing but a promise has none of those problems. And so it occurred to me that just like Klein was able to push Malevich's ideas about abstraction even further through technical innovation, I could push Klein's ideas about immateriality even further through the technical innovations of blockchain technology. A version of the zones on blockchain, I thought, would be the completion of art history's push towards immaterialization. Now, not only would the idea be fully immaterialized, but the very token that denotes it would be too. the ritual which transfers the token would also be immaterialized, and the ritual which burns that token would be immaterialized as well. No meeting at the River Seine for us. The different ideas of ownership, legal ownership, and intrinsic ownership would all be conferred through immaterial blockchain transactions. So there were a couple things I had to do to create the artwork beyond just the coding. First of all, the artwork, or the idea of the artwork, had to actually be something. Klein's zones were, remember, according to him, imbued with the deep blue that he was famous for. But I wanted my artworks to contain a different blue, mostly because Klein literally patented his own shade of blue, and I was very keen on not infringing on the patent rights of Mr. Klein. So I went out seeking my own shade of blue to place in the digital zones. I wanted this shade of blue to be special, so I went traveling, and I went here, to the north coast of Prince Edward Island, to create color studies. And after spending a considerable amount of time studying and debating, I settled on a shade of blue representing the exact horizon between Skye and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, exactly 3 hours before civil twilight. I took a photo at that time, but I deleted it because the token was never meant to represent the image. The token was meant to represent the idea. And the second thing that I had to create was belief. I felt like to do this, I'd have to clearly state my intentions and make an argument that I'd invested a considerable amount of time and research and a big chunk of my career into doing this. So I wrote a white paper, and I explained a lot of these ideas and how they had come to me. And that white paper, which I called the blue paper, naturally, is still available. And you can look at the original post on GitHub. And I think it's also a pretty good blockchain explainer for anybody who's coming at blockchain from the world of conceptual art. I coded the contract. The contract was a modified ERC20 token, as was the style at the time. And as is now standard in ERC 721 tokens, it has a burn function, but in keeping with Klein's ritual, anyone who burns the token also burns half the ETH that I received for it initially. I listed the token on Etherscan as IKB, an homage to Klein's patented color, International Klein Blue. And finally, on August 30th, 2017, I presented the digital zones of immaterial pictorial sensibility in an art gallery. After a 90-minute lecture at InterAccess Media Arts Center in Toronto, the contract went live, and at 8:38 p.m. on that night, the very first IKB token, token ID number 0, was transferred. Shortly after that, the very first IKB token was burned, and to this day, I still have no idea who did it. But if you're out there, I hope it was a very good experience for you. So it's time to wrap things up. In the blue paper, I made a few predictions about how I thought blockchain tokenization would affect the art world, and I wanted the IKB token to be a pure distillation of what blockchain could represent for art. What it represents is, in some ways, complete transparency about what Yves Klein, myself, and others think art is. Because in a lot of ways, an artwork has never been just about the physical thing. Any artwork is a token that connects you to an idea about a long past empire, or an idea about the person who created it, a political idea, or an idea about the nature of art itself. So what does this say about NFT artworks? I don't know. All this history doesn't mean that all NFTs are actually brilliant exercises in conceptual art. No, a lot of them are just as bad and just as shallow as skeptics might say they are. But this history does give us some context that artists can use to push forward and create new ideas. And maybe those ideas will be ones that really are best suited to be expressed through digital transactions. This art history shows us that there is actually a strong foundation to say that NFTs do something that was a natural part of the evolution of art, separating their idea from their physical manifestation. And now maybe we can all move on to judging the ideas that are behind them. This video essay was about the basic premise of NFTs, that art could be a non-physical expression. In some of the episodes we have coming up, we'll talk about other ideas in contemporary art and how they have found expression through blockchain technologies. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.